You are trying to sleep, but your brain will not stop. It is replaying a conversation from 3 days ago, analyzing what you said, what you should have said, what the other person meant, what they think of you now, whether they are still thinking about it. Or maybe it is not a conversation. Maybe it is a decision you have not made yet, a problem with too many possible outcomes. You tell yourself, I just need to figure this out, and then I can rest. But you do not figure it out. You think about it again from a slightly different angle, and still no answer, still no peace, just more thoughts. Maybe you check your phone, or get up for water, or try to read, but the thoughts follow you. They are always there, waiting. If this sounds familiar, you are not alone, and you are not broken. Tonight I want to tell you something about that voice, where it comes from, why it will not stop, and what it actually needs from you. Welcome to Lumina Slow English. I am speaking slowly and clearly so you can follow every word. This is real psychology. This is real English. Let's begin. Let's start by making a distinction. It is a distinction most people never make, and it changes everything. The distinction is between reflection and rumination. Reflection is thinking that moves forward. You consider a problem, you look at it carefully, and you arrive somewhere new, a decision, an insight, or a plan. Rumination is different. Rumination is thinking that goes in circles. You consider the same problem. You look at it from the same angles, and you arrive exactly where you started except more anxious. Both feel like thinking. Both can feel like solving, but only one of them actually is. Here is a simple test. After 10 minutes of thinking about a problem, do you feel clearer? Or do you feel more anxious than when you started? Clarity is reflection. More anxiety is rumination. Overthinking is not thinking too much. It is ruminating, cycling through the same thoughts, the same worries, the same scenarios without moving forward. Let me tell you about someone I will call Daniel. Daniel was smart, careful. He thought about things deeply before acting. People described him as thoughtful. But at night, Daniel could not turn his brain off. He would replay conversations from work, looking for signs that his manager was unhappy with him. He would lie awake before important meetings, rehearsing every possible thing that could go wrong. He would think about decisions he had already made, not to improve them, but just to worry about whether they had been right. He thought of this as preparation. He thought the thinking was keeping him safe. What he did not know was that there is a name for what he was doing. And that name, once he heard it, changed how he understood himself. The name is rumination. And Daniel is not unusual. Researchers estimate that over 70% of young adults engage in regular rumination. It cuts across personality types, across cultures, across levels of intelligence. In fact, and this is the part that surprises people, people who are more intelligent and more conscientious tend to ruminate more, not less. Because they care more about getting things right. And caring more about getting things right means spending more time going over the possibilities, which, for many people, becomes a loop they cannot exit. Overthinking is not a flaw. It is not evidence that you are too sensitive or too anxious. It is a specific, well-documented pattern in the brain. It has a name. It has a mechanism. And this is the part that matters. It has an exit. But before we get to the exit, we need to understand what is actually happening inside your brain when you overthink. And here is where it gets surprising. Vocabulary pause. Let's stop and name 3 words you have been absorbing in context. The first, overthink. To overthink means to think about something too much and for too long, especially in a way that does not lead to a decision or a solution. The prefix over means too much, beyond what is useful. Overthinking is not deep thinking. It is circular thinking. You can recognize it by one simple test. After a long time thinking, you feel worse, not better. The thinking has not helped. It has only repeated itself. The second, rumination. Rumination is a word borrowed from biology. Cows ruminate, they bring food back up from their stomach and chew it again. In psychology, rumination means bringing thoughts back up and chewing them again. The same thoughts, the same worries, over and over. Susan Nolen-Hoeksema, a psychologist at Yale University, spent decades studying rumination. She found it is one of the strongest predictors of depression, not because it creates problems, but because it prevents people from moving past them. The third, default. Default means the setting that is automatically used when nothing else is chosen. Your phone has default apps, your computer has default settings, and your brain has a default mode, the mental state it returns to whenever it is not actively focused on a task. For many people, that default is rumination, not because they chose it, but because, at some point, it became the brain's habit. Overthink, rumination, default. In 2001, a neuroscientist named Raichle made a discovery that changed how we understand the brain. He was studying what happens in the brain during rest. When people were not doing any particular task, he expected to see low activity. A brain at rest, he assumed, would be a quiet brain. He was wrong. When people were doing nothing, not solving a problem, not reading, not focusing on anything specific, a particular network of brain regions became highly active. Not slightly active, highly active. Raichle called this the default mode network. The default mode network is what your brain runs when it has nothing else to do. It is the brain's idle mode, its background program, and it does not rest. What does this network do? It does 3 things. It thinks about the past, it thinks about the future, and it thinks about other people, specifically what other people think of you. Sound familiar? That is overthinking, not an unusual mental state, not a sign of anxiety or disorder. The default mode network is doing exactly what it was built to do. Now here is the part that changes how you see yourself. The default mode network evolved for a reason. In our evolutionary past, the moments when humans were not actively hunting, building, or fleeing were not truly idle moments. They were planning moments, review moments. The brain used those quiet moments to ask, what went wrong recently? What threats might be coming? What do the people around me think of me? Because if they reject me, I may not survive. Replaying social interactions and analyzing what people thought of you was not neurotic. It was adaptive. It helped humans stay connected to their group, and connection to the group meant survival. The default mode network is ancient. It is powerful. And in the modern world, it runs on material it was never designed to process. Every unanswered email, every ambiguous message, every decision that has no clear right answer, every relationship that carries uncertainty. The default mode does not know that these are not survival threats. It processes them with the same urgency it would bring to genuine danger. This is not a flaw. It is a mismatch between an ancient brain and a modern life. And the people who suffer most from overthinking are often the ones whose default mode networks are most sensitive, most attuned to social signals, most careful about consequences, most invested in getting things right. Which means overthinking, at its root, is not a problem with how you think. It is a problem with how much you care. Here is what makes overthinking so difficult to interrupt. Rumination feels like it is working. When you are going over the same situation for the 15th time, it does not feel like wasted effort. It feels like thoroughness. It feels like you are being responsible, being careful, making sure you have considered everything. This is the trap. Susan Nolen-Hoeksema spent decades researching why people ruminate even when it clearly does not help. Her conclusion was this: ruminators genuinely believe that ruminating is preparing them for what comes next, that if they think about the problem enough times, the answer will eventually appear. But the opposite is true. Nolen-Hoeksema found that rumination actually impairs problem solving. People who ruminate generate fewer solutions to their problems, and the solutions they do generate are less effective than those generated by people who reflect briefly and then move on. The more you go over a problem without resolution, the less clearly you see it. There is also a neurological reason the loop continues. The default mode network and the prefrontal cortex, the deliberate thinking system we discussed in the episode on brain change, are supposed to work together. The default mode generates thoughts. The prefrontal cortex evaluates them, decides which ones matter, and redirects attention. But when you are tired, stressed, or emotionally depleted, the prefrontal cortex loses power. The default mode network runs without the brakes. This is why overthinking gets worse at night. Your prefrontal cortex has been working all day. By midnight, it has very little capacity to redirect the flood of thoughts the default mode keeps generating. You are not weaker at night. Your brain is running on less fuel. Nolen-Hoeksema also discovered something about how rumination spreads. It does not stay in one area of your life. When you begin ruminating about one thing, a work problem, a relationship tension, a health concern, the rumination tends to generalize. Other worries attach themselves to the loop. The loop grows. She called this co-rumination when it happens between people, two friends who go over the same problems together repeatedly without resolution. They feel understood, but the problem intensifies. Whether it happens alone in your head or together with someone else, the mechanism is the same. The loop creates the feeling of connection, of thoroughness, of care, and it uses that feeling to justify its own continuation. Understanding this is not enough to stop it, but it is where the possibility of stopping it begins. Vocabulary pause. 3 more words. The first, loop. A loop is a sequence that repeats itself. It starts, reaches a point, and goes back to the beginning. A thought loop is a pattern where the same thought triggers the same emotional response, which triggers the same thought again. Loops can be useful. Learning a skill involves many useful loops, but a rumination loop serves no purpose. It does not solve the problem. It only repeats it. The second, spiral. A spiral is similar to a loop, but it moves usually downward. A thought spiral is when one anxious thought leads to a slightly more anxious thought, which leads to an even more anxious one. Each cycle takes you deeper. You begin by worrying about one thing. 10 minutes later, you are worried about everything. That is a spiral. Recognizing when reflection has become a spiral is one of the most important skills in managing overthinking. The third, trigger. A trigger is something that activates a particular thought, emotion, or behavior automatically. Triggers can be external, a message, a place, a person, or internal, a memory, a feeling, a physical sensation. Understanding your triggers does not make them disappear, but it gives you a moment between the trigger and the response. And in that moment, there is a choice. Loop spiral trigger. Now I want to tell you about a different kind of voice. Ethan Kross is a psychologist and neuroscientist at the University of Michigan. He founded the Emotion and Self-Control Laboratory to study one specific question. What happens when the voice inside your head turns against you? He called this phenomenon chatter. Chatter is what happens when your inner voice becomes a source of anxiety rather than support. It replays your failures. It anticipates your humiliations. It tells you the worst version of every possible outcome. Chatter is rumination with a narrator. Cross discovered something that surprised him. The way you talk to yourself about a problem changes how your brain processes it, not metaphorically, neurologically. Brain scans show measurable differences. When you think about a difficult situation using why did I say that? What is wrong with me? Your brain stays inside the emotional experience. The distress activates the same regions that activate during physical pain. But when you use your own name or something shifts. Why did you say that? What were you thinking? The brain creates psychological distance. The experience is processed more like an outside observer would process it. The emotional charge reduces. The thinking becomes clearer. This is called self-distancing, and Cross and his colleagues have now documented it in dozens of experiments across many different types of emotional situations. Why does this work? When you use you are inside the experience. The threat is immediate. The nervous system responds accordingly. When you use your name or you create a small but meaningful gap. You are still thinking about the problem, but you are thinking about it the way a wise friend would think about your problem, with care, with perspective, without the full weight of being you in this moment. Cross found that this simple shift also reduces rumination. When people use their own name to think through a stressful experience, they spent less time going over it afterward. The loop had less grip. This is not a trick. It is a mechanism of the brain that was already there, waiting to be used. The default mode runs chatter. The observing self, the part that can step back and use your name, is also always available. You just have to remember to use it. Vocabulary pause. 3 final words. The first, chatter. Chatter means rapid, repetitive, often anxious talk. In everyday English, chatter is what birds do, a constant stream of small sounds without much meaning. Cross borrowed this word deliberately. Mental chatter is the constant stream of anxious thoughts that runs in the background of your mind, not solving anything, not helping, just making noise. Recognizing mental chatter as chatter rather than as truth, or as your real voice, is the first step toward reducing its power over you. The second, distance. Distance, in the psychological sense, means creating space between yourself and an experience. Psychological distance does not mean suppression. You are not pretending the thought is not there. You are changing your relationship to it. Instead of being the thought, you are observing the thought. This shift from inside to outside is one of the most well-supported tools in the psychology of emotion regulation. The third, perspective. Perspective is the point of view from which you see something. When you are inside an overthinking spiral, your perspective narrows. The problem fills your entire field of vision. Everything else disappears. Gaining perspective means widening that field, remembering that the problem is real, but it is not the only thing that is real. It does not minimize the problem. It restores its actual size. Chatter, distance, perspective. So here is the answer to the question in the title. Why do you overthink everything? Not because you are weak, not because you are anxious by nature, not because something is fundamentally wrong with the way your mind works. You overthink everything because you have a default mode network. Because that network was built over millions of years of evolution to think about threats, to anticipate problems, to replay social interactions and learn from them. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The problem is that in a modern life, with its constant information, its unresolved uncertainties, its digital conversations that never quite end, the default mode has more material than it was ever designed to process. It keeps running, and the prefrontal cortex, especially after a long, exhausting day, cannot keep up with the redirecting. This is not a flaw. It is a mismatch between an ancient brain and a modern world. And knowing that changes something. Because the next time the thought loop starts, the next time you find yourself replaying a conversation or rehearsing a future that has not happened, you do not need to fight it. You do not need to force yourself to be calm. You do not need to solve everything before you can rest. You just need to step back from the thoughts. Name the pattern. This is rumination. This is the default mode doing what it does. Not I am anxious. Not something is wrong with me. Just this is a pattern, and patterns can be interrupted. Then use your name. Ask yourself, not why am I thinking this, but what does this situation actually need from you right now? Notice what happens, not immediately, but gradually. The spiral slows, the loop loses intensity, the chatter becomes quieter. Not because you solved the problem, but because you stopped being inside it long enough to see it clearly. The brain that has been running this loop is the same brain that can learn to run something different, not through force, not through willpower, but through the small, consistent act of stepping back and observing instead of being inside the chatter. The default mode is not a destiny. It is a default, and defaults can be changed. Before you go, I have one question for you, and I want you to answer it in English in the comments below. Think of one thought that keeps coming back. The same situation, the same worry, the same question that you have been turning over in your mind without resolution. You do not need to explain it. You do not need to justify it. Just name it. One sentence, in English, in the comments. I will read them. This was Lumina Slow English. I am glad you stayed until the end, and I will see you in the next one.